Further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Dr. Joey Senat. Dr. Senat's going to speak to us about free expression and the other First Amendment rights of high school students, which is something that all of you should 100% care about. Good morning, Dr. Senat.
Good morning.
I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad that you're able to join us this morning. The weather's better. That's good. And I really appreciate that students and their teachers and whatever administrators allowing you to do this, because this is really important stuff. This is how you participate in your government, how you let government and everyone else know what you think and how things get solved in our society. So I'd like to, and again, as we go through this, if you've got questions, put them in the comments about something specifically I'm talking about. And I'll also leave time at the end, sort of want to find out what's going on at your schools that maybe you're concerned about, what you've been told you can't say or wear or do, and we'll go through some of those. But the first thing I want you to think about is, what do you think the greatest threat is to the First Amendment? I mean, what's threatening it? Government censorship is clearly something that is a problem, but your greatest threat, and I'll give you a hint. There's a survey that shows only 0.1% of Americans can name all 5 First Amendment freedoms. Only 0.1%. That's not good. Usually they can name speech and press and religion. Some people throw in the right to bear arms, which is not in the First Amendment. That's the Second Amendment. Or they might throw in the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. That's the Fourth Amendment. So the question is, if they don't know what their rights are, what's the greatest threat? It's our ignorance of what the First Amendment is. If it's hard to flex your rights, the title for this presentation today is Flex Your Rights. Well, you can't flex your rights if you don't know what your rights are. And if you're ignorant of those rights, it's really easy for people to take them away from you. And across the country, this happens all the time with high school students. They don't have a clue what their rights are. And so administrators are saying, no, you can't say this, you can't wear that political message or religious symbol to school, and those students are having their rights violated. Now, normally, if we did this in person, I usually begin by walking around and demanding that students give me whatever money they have in their pocket. And sometimes they're really shy about it, and I get kind of gruff. I mean, demand that they give it to me. And they'll hand it over. They'll give me their money. And then I make a point that, why did you do that? Why did you just hand a stranger what money you had in your pocket? And it's because I've got a microphone. And I'm an old white guy wearing a white work shirt and a tie. Yeah, that's intimidating to students. That's authority. That's your administration. And so students often get intimidated out of their rights without knowing what they are. And then you've got somebody telling you can't do something, and you taught to be respectful to authority, then you're going to hand over your rights. So we're going to try to give you some education about what those rights are. And I want you to always be respectful when you are challenging authority, because if you're not, then your behavior in that instance, or the way you speak back becomes the issue, instead of what government's doing to you, what rights they're taking away from you. So I urge students always to be respectful, simply because you look better in that situation, and people are much more sympathetic to your cause. Okay, so let's talk about, even if the public can name all 5 rights, they don't necessarily then know what they mean. For example, you hear people say, when they're trying to censor speech that they don't want to hear, they'll say, well, the First Amendment's not absolute. Okay, well, that's true. The First Amendment's not absolute. What would it mean if the First Amendment was absolute? Well, that would mean that government could never censor you or could never punish your speech. And that's not correct. We've got libel law. And by the way, don't forget, if you don't know, your state constitution offers you freedoms of speech and press. And our state Supreme Court has said those rights, under the way our state constitution is phrased, provide you even more rights of freedom of speech and press. But even that provision says you are responsible for abusing that right. And it talks about libel. So libel law exists. It's a way to punish people when they say things that are false and defamatory, things that are false and hurt someone's reputation. There are other kinds of speech that are unprotected by the First Amendment. For example, obscenities. And we won't get into the complicated First Amendment test, the Miller test, to understand whether something is either obscene and unprotected or whether it's indecent. And adults, consenting adults, have a right to have indecent speech. Obscenity, though, is unprotected. How do you tell the difference? It's really complicated. Oh, and by the way, obscenity does not mean profanity. Four-letter words are not obscene, okay? And in some cases, profanity might be protected. In some cases, in certain circumstances, it might not be, particularly in a school environment, okay? So they'll say, well, the First Amendment's not absolute, as though that means government can regulate all speech simply because some small categories are not protected. And that's not true. Government cannot regulate all speech simply because some small categories, well-defined, long-defined categories, are unprotected. So the next thing they might say is, well, you can't cry fire in a crowded theater, okay? Unfortunately, when they say that, they don't realize that that test was replaced by the U.S. Supreme Court. The clear and present danger test was replaced by the U.S. Supreme Court more than 50 years ago. So that's not the current test. So it shows a certain amount of ignorance about First Amendment law when someone throws that out. And by the way, the current test, and this is an example of very narrow category of speech that's not protected, it's under the Brandenburg test. And the test says, all right, the First Amendment protects speech that advocates an abstract idea, even the use of force or illegal conduct in the abstract. What it doesn't protect is speech directed to inciting or producing imminent illegal action, and the speech is likely to produce that action. So even if you're advocating for violence in an abstract way, an abstract idea, it would still be protected. That's important when you are trying to advocate sometimes for change in government, change in the way it operates, change in procedures. It's, you might say rhetorically, we're going to march on Washington. That's not a call to violence, okay? So we spend an entire class, I teach media law in what used to be called the journalism school at OSU. Now it's the School of Media and Strategic Communications. I teach media law, and we'll spend a whole day just on Brandenburg, trying to understand what speech is protected and what tiny little part of speech is. So there are a couple of other terms here that I'd like you to know, sort of educate you about the First Amendment. One of them is the term state action. And it doesn't mean like Oklahoma State. It means the generic term government. So for the First Amendment to apply in your situation, government has to be involved in the censorship. So what that means is private organizations and private businesses under the First Amendment can censor you as an employee, can fire you for what you say. Now, there are some states, we're not one of them in Oklahoma, but there are some states that have statutes that prohibit employers from firing people for their political speech or political activity. But under the First Amendment, for example, a network, TV network or a radio network could fire one of its employees, on-air talent, who has said things that are offensive. And the company can say, well, you are offending our listeners, our business, we're going to get rid of you. But government has a lot of trouble doing that. The First Amendment protects us from government action. So when you hear someone saying the First Amendment protects them from private action, that's not correct. It protects us, importantly, from what government does. So now the next term you should understand, concept, is preferred position. So that means that when government tries to censor speech, press, religion, the right to redress government for grievances, to assemble peacefully, when government tries to censor that, infringe on those rights, the speech, the right is placed way up here. It's given a preferred position. And the government attempt is way down here. And that government attempt is presumed to be unconstitutional. It's not permitted. So to get up over that hurdle, government's going to have to justify what it's doing. It's going to have to show to a court that this is not a violation of the First Amendment because, and if it's political, social, religious speech, the government has to have a compelling interest. And that usually means something like health, safety, and welfare of the public. So why is that important? Because the burden falls on government. Government has to go to court and prove that its restriction is justified, as opposed to you, the speaker, having to go to court and explain why your speech should be justified. That's a big difference. You don't want to go into court having the burden of proof. You want that to fall on the other side. So those are two important terms. There are also some important principles that you should understand. First is, why do we need the First Amendment? Why do we have it? Why does it exist? And if you think you've got an answer, please type it in the comments. Let's see that you're out there and you're working on this. But why do you think we have protection for speech and press, religion, redress government for grievances, to peacefully assemble? Why do these things exist in our federal Constitution and in some version and some other wording, usually in our state constitutions? And the reason is because we don't need it to protect popular speech. Speech that everybody likes, nobody complains about. Nobody's trying to stop it. But when you put out music with lyrics that older people like me suddenly object to, they forget about the music they listened to when they were younger. When you have content on television, suddenly people don't like, or content on movies, or political speech, where someone's advocating an idea that others don't like. That's when we need the First Amendment. Give you a quote from Gene Polizinski, and he spoke at our First Amendment Congress back in 2005. And he said, we don't need it to protect popular speech. We need it to protect the fringes of society, to listen to the voices we would rather not hear, to consider the ideas we would rather not consider. And sometimes those fringe elements end up in the mainstream, end up being accepted. Abolitionists in the South were not considered a mainstream idea, even across other parts of the country at first. Civil rights movement, not considered a mainstream idea in a lot of parts of this country. But they've obviously won their way through. And the only way you can do that is having a marketplace of ideas. Probably the most used First Amendment theory by the US Supreme Court. Marketplace of ideas. The idea should come out there, let truth and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. And that phrase comes from John Milton. If you've ever had to read some from John Milton in Old English, I know it's difficult, but he wrote something called Areopagitica. And it was a brochure, a pamphlet, arguing against censorship, prior restraint by the British Crown. You had to have a license in order to publish. And a lot of what we consider First Amendment ideas now actually come out of that. And for example, one was the idea that who among us is smartest, so smart that you can decide for everyone else what gets into that marketplace of ideas. So we want ideas that are everything people believe in to be there. But we want other ideas that come in and challenge. And it works best when it's on a small, like a college campus. It tends to work better. We come to some consensus on which ideas are best, which solutions to government problems are best. So the idea again is that we need a marketplace where these ideas compete, because you really can't say an idea is false as you can with false advertising. Another category of unprotected speech is false and misleading advertising. That's easier to prove. False idea is difficult, and it needs to be considered by the group, all of us. So another idea that comes out of New York Times v. Sullivan, and that's probably the most famous First Amendment case there is. It deals with libel, by the way, not out of a newspaper story, but out of an advertisement. And out of New York Times v. Sullivan, the court said that there's a profound national commitment in this country that we should have robust, wide open, uninhibited discussions. Public debate should be robust, uninhibited, wide open. That doesn't mean it's always civil. The court recognized that. In fact, it said sometimes speech serves its purpose best when it actually brings about dispute and stirs people to anger. So it's not about always being civil. Our system has always recognized that people will get angry. In fact, we had a justice was in one of those earlier cases before we quite got to Brandenburg test, was shaping the clear and present danger test, who talked about even ideas we think fraught with death should be protected unless they so imminently imperil our country that immediate action is needed. Another idea comes out of Texas v. Johnson, and this has to do with burning flags as a means of protest. That will make people angry. Burning an American flag as protest. And this occurred down in Texas and Dallas, and people were incensed that this man was doing this as a means of protest. And it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court said, again, we have this underlying bedrock principle of the First Amendment, and that is that government may not stop an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive. We have this bedrock principle is that we don't allow government to stop ideas simply because everyone else finds the idea offensive. And so that's the case that says flag burning as a means of protest is protected speech. By the way, hate speech, this rather nebulous term, hate speech, is protected by the First Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court has said that multiple times in different ways. One was a case involving the term the slants, and that's a band of Asian Americans who said, we're going to call ourselves a derogatory term we've been called our entire lives, slant-eyed. We're going to adopt it and make it powerful for us. And they wanted to trademark that name for their band. And the United States Patent and Trademark Office said, no, that's slanderous, it's offensive. And the US Supreme Court said, we don't allow government to decide those things when it comes to a trademark. That is a term that can be trademarked. It's protected, even though clearly some people would find that an offensive term. In this case, perhaps less so because the band is adopting it for their own name. But the idea that offensive alone is not enough to stop speech. So let's talk about how those ideas evolve in the First Amendment cases that deal with you at school. Now, remember, state action means that there has to be government involved. So if you're at a private school, then the First Amendment doesn't protect you. You might have contract. In other words, when your parents signed up to send you there, was there any agreement on what rights students would be given? If there's not, you can't rely on the First Amendment or your state constitution to protect you in that regard for speech and press. But if you're a public student, then we have some cases that have gone through the US Supreme Court that say, here are what your rights are. And the first one I hope you've heard of is called Tinker. In fact, it was some family members, along with some other students, the Tinkers. One of them actually spoke to our First Amendment Congress years ago. Most non-belligerent man you ever meet, and yet he has stood up for his rights and the rights of others. He's very polite, very humble, but he knows what his rights are and he knows what his principles are, and he stood up for them. So this case is back in the late 60s. During the Vietnam War. And you can probably tell I'm old enough that I was around at that time. So protests against the Vietnam War. If we think we're a divided country now, that was another time when this country was bitterly divided. And so these students wanted to protest at high school to protest the Vietnam War. And they were going to do so by wearing black armbands. And this is a rather old custom, but people used to wear black armbands to demonstrate, to signify that they were in mourning. So the students said, well, we're going to wear these to mourn for the soldiers, our soldiers, their soldiers, the residents, the people, everyone who's a civilian, everyone who has died in this war. And we're going to wear this to signify that we think the war is wrong. So the principal heard about it, and he calls them all into his office. I don't want you doing this. You can't wear these. Well, that got rid of most of the students. They said, okay, well, I don't want to be suspended or expelled, so I'm not going to participate. But this core of students who believed in what they were saying decided to wear it. Now, they don't know that their case is going to end up before the US Supreme Court. They have no idea. You can't guarantee that your case will be heard by the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court has discretion to which cases it hears, and it hears a tiny percentage of the petitions it receives each year. They had no idea if it went there, they would win. That took a lot of guts. That took a lot of courage. And again, respectful people still wore their armbands, and they were suspended. And so they fought this in court, and it makes its way to the US Supreme Court. And the court lays down a fundamental principle. It says students and teachers do not shed their First Amendment rights, their constitutional rights, when they pass through that schoolhouse gate. They don't shed them at the schoolhouse gate. So if you're a public student, you still have First Amendment rights. What's more, the court also said that while it's not absolute protection, school officials can't censor simply because they have some undifferentiated apprehension that some problem will be caused. In other words, they can't, and they also, the court said, can't stop it simply because they themselves find the idea offensive or they fear that other people will find it offensive. So what that means is, the court said, administrators can censor student speech when they can show that that speech would likely cause a substantial disruption or material interference with school activities, the discipline necessary to have school. Again, that's some modifiers on there. You know, substantial disruption, not just any disruption. You know, material interference with, not just any interference with. So it set the bar high. Again, administrators can't simply say, we're not going to let you speak because other people are offended by the political message you wear on your shirt or your button or your particular religion. That is important. Now, again, it's not absolute, but that's pretty high bar that says you still get to express your personal social, political, religious beliefs at a public school, okay? Now, the next case that comes up, well, let's go back a second. I'll use a point here on what substantial disruption means, and it means that the student speech must cause it. So, for example, in Florida years ago, there was a principal who was opposed to gays and lesbians. And he knew that one of the students, female student, was a lesbian, and he called her into his office and said, I want you to quit talking to the younger students about this. And I will suspend you if you continue to wear your gay pride buttons and shirts, your rainbow buttons. And other students, her friends and other students, stood up for her. And they started wearing gay pride, rainbow buttons. They wore shirts, t-shirts. They stood up for her. And the principal was so outraged and angered by this that he began suspending these students. And it wasn't one or two, it was like a dozen students or more, and he's suspending them. And those students fought that in court. And they went to a federal district judge. When you stand up for your First Amendment rights, you go to federal district court to start with. So they go to federal district court, and the judge says what this man has done is wrong. And when the school district tried to argue that the student's speech had caused the substantial disruption, all these students being suspended, the judge pointed out that it wasn't the students doing that, it was the administrator who was doing that the administrator was suspending all these students. He was causing the substantial disruption. Now, the kicker to this is they ended up demoting him. And for a while, he worked in the administration office, but then they let him go back and they gave him the option to become a teacher. And the class he was going to teach was basically principles of American government. And here's a man who clearly did not understand American government, the principles of our system, but was going to be teaching. So here's another example I use on substantial disruption, material interference. There was another case out of Florida in which a student showed up for Halloween with a t-shirt that had condom packages attached to it. And she was handing these condoms out to her students. And the principal was outraged. You cannot do this at our school. And her mother defended her and said, she's doing this because she has friends who have, female friends who have unwanted pregnancies. She has friends who've, come down with STDs because of their unprotected sexual activity. So she cares about these other people, and she is handing these out as a message to have protected sex. Now, that case, as far as I couldn't find it, ever went to court. It made the news. But did that student cause a substantial disruption, a material interference with school activities? And I would doubt that. She's entitled to hand out her message before class, before school starts, afterward, between classes, as long as it's not causing a substantial disruption. Now, an example of what might cause a substantial disruption, material interference, has dealt with the wearing of Confederate flags on clothing at schools where there is a history of racially motivated violence. And courts have said that is an example of where the administrators are able to bring evidence to court to show that we've already had problems. We've had violence in our schools based on race, and this is simply motivating, inciting more violence. And those cases, the administrations have been upheld. So there's a difference between simply wearing an armband and then actually having someone inciting violence in your school. That symbolic speech that is wearing the armband, for example. There are students who've been suspended across the country for wearing other gay pride material. Those have generally been then overturned by the courts when they're fought. Courts say that's not a substantial disruption. And some of the argument by the school administrators has been, well, if we allow you to wear your gay pride shirt, then other students who are not tolerant will beat you up. That is not a justification for stopping someone's speech. That's actually called a heckler's veto. And the system we have in this country says that government is required to stop the people who are the least tolerant from actually acting violently toward the speaker. That's why you'll see maybe at a protest, two groups that are screaming at each other and there are police in between them. The protesters and the protesters of the protesters are allowed to speak. Government, police keep them apart. Well, in the school system, that would mean the government, the school administrator, needs to take action to stop and punish those who would actually take violence on someone for speaking their mind. We had another student, was up in Dearborn, Michigan, who was suspended for wearing a t-shirt that said, had a big picture of George Bush at the time, and it had a big circle with an X through it. And above it, it said international, and below it said terrorist, international terrorist. And this student went to a school that was predominantly students whose families had come from the Middle East. And his message was, I believe that the man who has started this war in Iraq is an international terrorist. Now, that might make some students very angry. He was suspended when a teacher noticed that he was wearing that in the cafeteria, and he was brought into the principal's office, and the principal said, you've got to take that off. Go home, replace it, turn it inside out, something. You can't have that. Well, when it went to court, the student pointed out he'd worn it several times before and no one had noticed. Students were not substantially disrupted. The educational activities were not materially interfered with because he was wearing his political message. And you see an analogy there, the similarities between that and the Tinker case, the symbolic speech. And so, unsurprisingly, the federal judge in that case upheld the student's rights and said the administration was wrong for suspending him for wearing that shirt. At the same time, we have another student in another place who's suspended for wearing a shirt that says whack Iraq. So that's still a political message. Now, it doesn't mean, for example, courts have said having holes in your jeans is not a political message. So schools have some authority over dress codes. Length of hair has been an issue in our state years ago, and court said the district didn't show any link between learning and length of hair, which affects a student far beyond the school day. That's 24/7 for a student. So what constitutes a substantial disruption, material interference, is really, as we say in the law, it's always fact-based. What's that situation like? But remember, you have a right under Tinker to express your political, social, religious values and beliefs. Again, that won't mean, that means that government, the administration can stop you from wearing cigarette advertising, liquor, and indecent material, because indecent material for minors is not protected. So let's move to the next case. It's called the Bethel case, and this involves students speaking at a high school assembly in support of another student running for student government office. And the student's speech is filled with sexual innuendos. And he says stupid things like, he's firm in his pants. And so the school assembly, the students are just going nuts at this. Some of them are laughing. The court later pointed out some of them were embarrassed. You know, freshmen in high school are fairly young. And they ended up that the court drew a distinction between this case and Tinker. Even though the young man's speech was political, the court said the difference is that this was in school-sponsored expression, a school-sponsored environment. It wasn't just his personal belief. It was in a situation the school was sponsoring. So now we've got a divergence. We have Tinker on one side and starting to diverge away with Bethel. And the next case, and if you've worked at a student newspaper in your high school, you may have heard of this case. It's called Hazelwood. Hazelwood goes further with Bethel and says that school administrators have a great deal of authority to control what is put out in the student newspaper. Now, that's when the school newspaper is produced as part of the curriculum, as part of your class. You're getting credit hours for it. The teacher, the school, the principal can regulate that. Doesn't have to, is not required to. And there are schools around the country where where principals have said, no, we're not going to do this. In fact, we had some years ago, a principal, a teacher, and the student editor came and spoke at the conference because the principal had okayed. He did not normally do prior restraint. He wasn't insisting on doing it this time. The teacher and the students went to him to give him a heads up that they were doing a set of stories about sex, but in particular, oral sex. This was back during the Bill Clinton era, and students were treating oral sex as though it had no psychological effects, that you couldn't get a disease. And the students didn't do something that was sensationalist. They wrote fact-based stories about, yes, you can get diseases. They talked to experts about the psychological effects, that this is, still a sexual act. And some of the parents were outraged, and they went to the school board and tried to get this principal fired. The school board didn't do it. So if this man had allowed his students to deal with a serious issue. Now, how many of you know someone, a young woman, who has had an unwanted pregnancy? How many of you know someone, one of your friends has got an STD through unprotected sex? These are important issues. Hazelwood dealt with stopping stories that dealt with divorce. Well, divorce happens. Only about 25% of Oklahomans ever go on to earn a college degree. My point is, if you don't learn to deal with serious issues, actually at your school, to have those kind of discussions, then where do you learn to do it? Most Oklahomans don't go on to college. And even if they go to college, they may not have a class or something in an environment where they learn to deal with those. So if we're going to have that meaningful marketplace of ideas occur, then we need to have high school students learning how to deal with difficult adult subjects before they leave and graduate and go out into the real world. Now, the last case to deal with quickly here is what I call bong hits for Jesus, because this was up in Alaska, and some students, as it was during the Olympics, and the Olympic torch went by the school, and as it does, all the students had been let out of the school to go watch the torch go by, and the students who did this had never even gone onto school grounds that morning. They were late to school. They're across the street, and TV cameras are on, and they unfurl this banner that says "Bong hits for Jesus." I have no idea what that means. It was just nonsensical. But they were suspended, and they fought for their rights, and they actually won at the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which gave them the benefit of the doubt that this was political speech. But the U.S. Supreme Court took their rights away and said that if student speech could be reasonably interpreted as encouraging illegal drug use, then that speech could be censored. So that takes another bite out of Tinker, that your right to speak your personal beliefs. But the court did say, the opinions did say, concurring opinions did say, but this is not about politics. So if your state, and Alaska had this several times, has a referendum on whether to legalize, for example, marijuana, students are protected. They're entitled to share their views on that political issue, but not encourage other students to do illegal drugs. So if there are questions here, we've got a few minutes. I wanted to leave some time. If there's something that's happened, for example, if you've ever been told in school that you can't wear one of the little wrist bracelets that says "I heart boobies," we've had 2 federal circuits say those are protected speech. That's social speech. It's not that outrageous. So do we have any comments? Andy, if you can help me out there.
Sure. I don't see any comments yet, but we'll give folks just a minute. Folks, if you're watching at home or school or work or wherever, please feel free to drop a comment in the chat. I've been trying to start from that side. I think if you're watching on Facebook, it may not work as well because it's a Facebook group rather than a page, and apparently that's an issue. Go figure. But this has been great. I was trying to think up any other questions that we typically get during this. And the thing that stood out to me, as it has in the past, is the bong hits for Jesus. I remember that from previous years. When I was in school, we ran into some of the same issues you mentioned, things like bracelets and T-shirts, in this general sense that, oh, you can't say that here because you might upset other people. And is that what you said was a heckler's veto? Is like when the government is saying you can't do something because it might upset somebody else?
Not just upset them, and they can't do it simply because it's going to offend other people, but the heckler's veto would go a step further, where administrators will say, and this tends to be with pro-gay and lesbian messages, no, other people are so intolerant in our school, students, that they will beat you up. And that's right. A heckler's veto, when they actually stop the speech because someone is violent against that speaker.
I'm going to go search the names of all the super PACs and see if heckler's veto is already a super PAC. That's a good name for that. Just on that note, though, so I can hear school administrators saying, well, maybe it's not against the law, but it's against our policy. Do school policies have the same effect as law, or in this situation, are they regarded the same?
A school policy cannot supersede your federal constitutional or state constitutional rights. Those policies must comply with this law, which would be, the First Amendment. Right. Constitutions outweigh school policy. So, we've had example a few years ago at Deer Creek, where a student was suspended for wearing a shirt that said Black Lives Matter. And he'd worn it several times before someone noticed. And the school said it had a policy of not allowing speech that was divisive. And and he made an uproar, and the ACLU went to bat for him, and the school rethought that policy. That was clearly political speech he was entitled to have.
Right. Interesting. Well, Dr. Senat, thank you again. This has been great as always. Thanks for being here, and have a great rest of the day.
You too. Thank you, everybody. And you're always welcome to email me if you have questions about your First Amendment rights. And you can find me at OSU, and I will, if I need to, forward those on to some other folks who are attorneys, and we'll try to help you out.
Right. Hey, before you go, we have one question that just came in from Laura Akers, who will be here in our third session. But she asks, Dr. Senat, do you have any ideas for how to increase public knowledge around knowing the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment?
Yeah, and of course, this session is one of those. We need more real education in K through 12. By the way, FOI Oklahoma used to sponsor some lesson plans for students, for teachers, to teach students about their 5 rights. And so we each and every one of us sort of need to take it on personally to learn them and teach others about them, and confront ignorance when we can.
Right. And we actually have that that curriculum still on our website. I will drop it into the chat right now. There's a link to it. It's pretty great. It is a great resource. And so if you are an educator out there and you're looking for a curriculum to use, that's a great place to start. And a lot of it can be used in a distance learning format like we're in right now. Okay, super. Well, again, thank you for being here. Have a great rest of the day.